The pilot's seat inside the Arcanian battlecruiser Duskwind Blade had been rebuilt to match human biology. But even after nearly a month of field trials, Tyrell Mason still felt like he was just borrowing someone else's ride. The MindLink visor strapped to his head allowed him to control the ship by thought, translating his intent into machine-readable instructions. But that mental connection had a lag, just enough to remind everyone that he wasn't from Arcos, and hadn't grown up flying these living starships like the native crew had. Flight Officer Mason. The crisp voice of Commander Rilke Dean came through the internal comms. No static, no emotion, just firm authority. Come to the command bridge. Tactical briefing. On my way, Tyrell answered, flipping off his controls and stepping into the humming halls of the ship. The corridors pulsed softly with color, responding to movement like they could feel you passing through. Unlike Earth's metal-and-weld ships, this one breathed. It adjusted around its crew like a second skin. The bridge of Duskwind Blade wasn't just functional, it was designed to impress. Projections hovered in midair, swirling stars, enemy models, constantly shifting threat maps. Arcanian operators stood at circular consoles, hands moving through holographic readouts, fully synchronized with the ship's bio-AI core. To Tyrell, human command decks back home now felt like ancient relics. Yesterday's flight trial, Commander Dean began immediately, not bothering with a greeting. Her skin shimmered faintly with silver circuits embedded in fractal patterns, a mark of high military status on Arcos. You exceeded expected metrics by nearly 20%. Tyrell gave a small nod. Thank you, ma'am, he said carefully. But her voice hadn't sounded impressed. If anything, it sounded like she was confused. She tapped the display beside her, and a new set of flight paths appeared. His movements from the last test, looping and darting in patterns far from standard formations. The question, she said flatly, is whether this result comes from unpredictable human thinking or from simple ignorance of proper procedure. Around them, other Arcanians turned their gaze toward Tyrell. Not openly hostile, just curious. Watching. Measuring. Like scientists testing a new element. With respect, Tyrell answered, studying the replay, your doctrine is built around systems, predictable opponents, shared training. Human instincts evolved differently. Clarify, she said. Your pilots optimize efficiency. Ours? We train to survive chaos. When rules break down. He pointed to the flight simulation showing his erratic dodge maneuvers. These don't look normal because they're not meant to be clean. They're meant to confuse. Commander Dean studied him silently. She didn't nod. Didn't react. You believe unpredictability matters more than precision, she finally said. I think both have a place. If everyone thinks the same way, the enemy only needs to break one system. If we all think differently, there's no one failure point. He didn't look away, even as the silence stretched. He knew she wasn't just listening. She was judging. Not just him, but whether Earthlings had any place in an Arcanian fleet. She turned, speaking to another officer nearby. Strategist Allen, update tomorrow's trial settings. Introduce adaptive threat response scenarios. Include non-patterned movement profiles. Yes, Commander, came the reply. Allen's expression flickered, half intrigued, half uneasy. Tyrell caught it. The change wasn't small. For a military that had relied on centuries of rigid perfection, this was a shift, and it was because of him. Officer Mason, Commander Dean said again, her voice now carrying a different tone. Still firm, but with something else. Interest, maybe. Or cautious approval. You've adapted remarkably, given the biological and cultural mismatch. That is not a small accomplishment. I appreciate that, ma'am. This alliance only works if we prove that difference isn't weakness, she said, now addressing the room. It must be strength, compatibility, tactical benefit. Yes, ma'am. That's what I'm aiming for. Hope, she said sharply, is not a strategy. Tyrell kept his face still, but his chest tightened. We require evidence that human systems can improve, not dilute, Arcanian combat effectiveness. Her eyes were sharp, but her posture had shifted. Less distance now. Less cold calculation. She wasn't just talking strategy anymore. She was watching him closely, reading something behind the numbers. He sensed something unexpected. Not emotion exactly, but interest that went beyond professional curiosity. A silent test, not just of skill, but of trust. We'll find that evidence in tomorrow's session, she finished, giving him a formal dismissal, but also a subtle nod that said he'd passed for now. What followed were more than just piloting tests. The exercises forced the crew to rethink how different minds could work together under fire. No time for second guesses. No room for misunderstandings. When survival depended on instinct and reflex, they had to rely on partners who thought in completely alien ways. Tyrell pushed himself harder than ever, drawing from Earth's instinctual flying and stretching the living ship's responses to levels even the Arcanians hadn't considered. Together, man and ship performed moves no manual had ever documented. Incoming plasma strike. Direction vector, 77A, pattern Mark IV. Announced tactical specialist Myra Vallon, her voice level and calm, the kind that only came from high-pressure training drilled into muscle memory. Authorized to evade. Execute now. Copy that, Tyrell Mason replied, already locking into the neural loop. His mind synced instantly with Duskwind Blade's interface, instincts flowing straight into motion. The cruiser twisted sharply into maneuvers no Arcanian pilot would have dared attempt, spinning through gravity-defying rolls and shifts that bent, but didn't break, the ship's flexible frame. She shouldn't even be able to handle that, a voice murmured over an open fleet comm. It wasn't judgment, just stunned confusion. Human spatial awareness follows different geometric logic, Commander Rilke Dean responded calmly. Her tone had shifted, not cool or condescending, but analytical, fascinated. His piloting doesn't follow our training models, she continued, watching the flight readouts, but he's achieving results we didn't think possible. The scenario concluded as Duskwind Blade cut through a full barrage with evasive flight paths no Arcanian simulation had predicted, moving unpredictably, but effectively. The takeaway was clear. It wasn't about whose method was better. It was about discovering that both approaches, used together, could do more than either alone. Mason, Commander Dean said as the simulation faded and real-time systems kicked back online, report to my quarters. Debrief. Her ready room was quieter, built for reflection rather than command. The lighting adjusted automatically, warmer than the bridge, less clinical. She gestured to a chair across from her, her expression less formal than usual. Your sync with the ship has surpassed all projected thresholds, she said, bringing up a floating screen filled with graphs and data spikes. But more than that, your tactical thinking is expanding how this crew understands flexibility in real-time combat. Tyrell gave a cautious smile. Should I take that as good or disruptive? It's valuable, she said simply, and for the first time, her voice held something softer. Our systems depend on patterns. But when enemies figure out those patterns, they become weaknesses. You introduce friction. Friction forces evolution. She leaned slightly forward, studying him, and added, unpredictability forces adaptation. And adaptation is survival. That slight smile again, subtle, but real. I'm recommending an extension to your post on Duskwind Blade. Tyrell blinked. Extension. Originally, this assignment was limited, 1 month, trial only. Enough to test cross-species crew alignment, she said, but there was something else behind her words, something she didn't say outright. Your performance justifies longer-term observation. 6 months minimum. Potentially permanent. The word permanent hung in the air heavier than he expected. This wasn't just about a longer contract. It meant cultural immersion, full commitment to a system that wasn't his. It meant reshaping his identity to belong to a military, a people, and a command structure very different from Earth's. And maybe it meant staying close to a commanding officer whose interest had begun to stray beyond tactical curiosity. Commander, he asked carefully, what's your honest view on long-term integration between humans and Arcanian forces? She didn't look away. I believe, she said quietly, that some partnerships produce outcomes neither side could reach alone. In combat. In everything, Flight Officer Mason. Her eyes held his, not professionally, but personally. It was more than a statement of strategy. It was a signal. Before he could respond, a soft chime signaled an urgent incoming communication. She tapped her console without breaking her gaze, then finally turned her attention to the message. "Dismissed for now," she said, professional tone sliding back into place. As Tyrell stepped out, the quiet stuck with him, not just her words, but the implications. Tactical compatibility was measurable. But what about the kind that wasn't? With the training trials behind them, Duskwind Blade now moved into contested space. The border regions around the Veyron Expanse, where real-world combat would test whether humans and Arcanians could actually fight side by side when lives, not data, were on the line. The fleet had grown, ships from 6 different species now flying in formation under a fragile alliance. Keeping them coordinated required more diplomacy than most battles. And it was Rilke Dean, now elevated to operational lead, whose voice rang across the fleet channel. All units maintain Delta 7. Adjust velocity to intercept Vector Bravo 9. Enemy signatures approaching. At his station, Tyrell scanned threat maps and real-time feeds. His neural link felt almost like part of him now, syncing with Duskwind Blade at speeds he no longer had to think about. "Incoming," warned Keithel, the ship's lead navigator. Enemy vessels moving in staggered trilance formation. They're mimicking fleet-wide communication lag, trying to exploit timing gaps between species. Rilke responded sharply. "Confirmed. Mason, prepare for full independent maneuver clearance." Tyrell nodded once, jaw tightening. "Understood, Commander." "Engaging." "If fleet coordination drops," Commander Dean said coolly over the fleet channel, "we fall back on tactical freedom. No lag. No hesitation." "Confirmed," Tyrell responded, already feeling the shift ripple through Duskwind Blade systems. The ship's semi-sentient core responded to his shifting thoughts, reconfiguring itself for his erratic piloting style, freeing him from standardized protocols while still feeding data into the fleet's network. What followed wasn't just a battle. It was a breaking point, a real-time test of whether species who barely understood each other's instincts could function as a single combat unit. The opposing fleet had done their homework. Their attack patterns weren't random, they exploited communication stalls, taking advantage of the microsecond gaps that happened when 7 different military doctrines tried to move like one. "We're losing sync," barked Tactical Officer Nara. Her usually calm tone now edged with frustration. "They're exploiting response latency. Our signals are overlapping, not aligning." Commander Dean's voice cut through, steady and sharp. "Then we stop aiming for perfect sync. We switch to functional sync. Prioritize outcome, not method. All units, switch to autonomous engagement." She turned toward Tyrell. "Mason, let's see what you can do when the leash is off." That was all the permission he needed. With no need to mirror or match fleet movements, Duskwind Blade became something else, something more dangerous. The restrictions lifted, and Tyrell flew like a storm, his mind and the ship responding as one. No pattern, no predictability, just pure reactive motion, forcing enemy vessels into situations they hadn't anticipated. "They're assuming we'll keep using Arcanian tactics," Tyrell said between maneuvers, pulling a tight spiral through overlapping enemy fire. Tactical displays around the command deck lit up with new enemy vectors, each tailored to counter traditional strategies. "So, what's your suggestion?" Dean asked, already moving toward his logic. "Break their assumptions. Go full asymmetry. Force them into territory they can't model. Do it." What followed wasn't clean. It wasn't elegant. But it worked. The Arcanians had brought precision. Tyrell brought chaos. Together, they delivered results. The hostile fleet started to crack. Unable to adjust to the blend of raw unpredictability and sharp biotech precision, they faltered, then retreated. When it was over, the shift in atmosphere on the bridge was almost physical. Pressure gave way to subtle ease. Not celebration, not yet, but the kind of quiet relief that only comes after surviving what should have gone badly. "Mason," said Commander Dean, stepping forward. Her voice no longer flat. It carried the quiet weight of earned approval. Your tactical decisions during the engagement surpassed every benchmark we had. Thank you, Commander, Tyrell replied, aware that several bridge officers were still looking his way, some with respect, others with curiosity that wasn't strictly about strategy. In fact, Dean continued, her voice taking on a layered tone, your interface with the ship has become so efficient, I no longer consider you part of the experiment. No. Tyrell raised an eyebrow. Essential, she said simply. Behind her, Navigator Keithel chuckled. That's a strong word, Commander. Sure you don't mean favored? I mean what I said, Dean replied, unfazed, though her eyes flicked to Tyrell's for half a second longer than necessary. Though indispensable might be more accurate. Or maybe, added Nara with a sly grin, we just start calling him what he is, your personal pet project. That brought scattered laughter. It wasn't mockery, it was the kind of ribbing that came from comfort, not exclusion. But Rilke didn't laugh it off. She paused, then nodded slightly. Pet project, she repeated, tone thoughtful. That might not be far from the truth. Her admission caused a few raised brows across the bridge, and some exchanged glances that said more than words. Something had shifted. Whatever line had once marked Tyrell as an outsider, it was blurring fast. Whatever they were becoming, crew, partners, allies, it was no longer just a test. It was working. And everyone could feel it. The aftermath of the skirmish brought more than rest. New orders arrived, expanding their operational role. Duskwind Blade had proven its worth, and now, they'd be leading more than just tactical runs. Commander Dean was pulled deeper into fleet strategy, her voice now echoing in high-level joint command briefings between ships from across the Allied coalition. The bridge buzzed with new energy. Officers coordinated with other species via sleek holographic links, each call layered with tension, diplomacy, and the kind of real-time cultural translation that made military objectives look easy in comparison. The Arcturon front requires multi-species coverage, Dean announced during one intership conference. We need to integrate capabilities from 7 distinct forces. The screen lit up with fleet compositions, each with its own strengths, weaknesses, and operational philosophy. And somewhere in the heart of it all, between instinct, ship, and mind, Tyrell Mason sat ready, already adapting to whatever impossible strategy came next. Commander Rilke Dean stood before the Joint Fleet's senior leadership, her image projected into dozens of warships through high-definition holo channels. Behind her, animated fleet models showed formation overlays accounting for everything, from crystalline swarm ships to pulse-driven light forms that moved by quantum phase distortion rather than thrust. Victory doesn't come from uniformity, she explained, sweeping a hand to expand the displays. It comes from knowing how to turn contrast into advantage. At his console, Tyrell Mason kept his focus on tactical analytics and system diagnostics. Once merely an observer in these high-level war briefings, he'd gradually become a contributing voice. His ability to exploit unpredictability was shifting how the command group viewed cross-species strategy. From the core fleet's command vessel, Admiral Ixtran leaned forward slightly, addressing the group. Commander Dean, your report on human integration notes remarkable adaptability, the Admiral said, voice modulated through multiple language converters. Can we expect similar outcomes with other human pilots? Uncertain, Rilke replied smoothly, though her eyes briefly flicked toward Tyrell, revealing her answer wasn't entirely diplomatic. It was personal. Mason possesses an uncommon mix of tactical reflex and adaptability to non-human systems, she continued. Scaling that would require thorough vetting. And your recommendation for such vetting? Prolonged deployment of existing integrations. No mass expansion until performance thresholds are revalidated long-term. Though professional in tone, her language carried undertones not lost on the crew nearby. She wasn't just protecting protocol, she was protecting him. The strategic session stretched for hours, deep diving into deployment patterns, fleet coordination dynamics, and real-time adjustments necessary to counter adversaries who had prepared for individual military styles but not for a unified front. When the last of the hololinks disengaged and officers resumed their regular posts, the command deck eased into a more relaxed rhythm. There was space again, for informal words, unfiltered opinions, and the occasional jab. "Well," said Navigator Keithel with a crooked grin, breaking the silence first. "Looks like someone's got a soft spot for her favorite Terran." "Soft spot?" Commander Dean repeated, arching an eyebrow, but not with real annoyance. "Protective's more accurate," said Tactical Officer Velnari, smirking as she leaned against her console. "The way you talked about Mason in that briefing sounded more like a diplomatic guardian than a commander." "I describe all valuable personnel with accuracy," Dean replied dryly. But there was a subtle shift in her posture. She knew what they were implying, and she wasn't entirely denying it. "Of course," Keithel replied innocently, "though most personnel don't receive the kind of hand-tailored attention that makes them feel curated." "Curated?" Dean echoed, amused. "More like nurtured," Velnari teased. "A personal project." The laughter that followed was warm, the kind that only came from a crew forged in battle. Teasing their commander was a rare privilege, and a sign of earned trust. Rilke raised an eyebrow, feigning offense. "Mason is a key asset. He requires development, not doting." "A pet, then?" Velnari asked, grinning. No one said it, but... More laughter, until Rilke looked across the deck and locked eyes with Tyrell. Her tone shifted. "If you must label it," she said, voice even, "then yes. I suppose you could say he's mine." Silence fell like gravity. Veterans, tacticians, officers, none of them moved. None dared speak. And then Tyrell, calm and certain, responded without flinching. "Only yours." The command deck held its breath. The playful teasing had turned into something deeper, undeniable. Not protocol. Not strategy. Just truth. Commander Rilke Dean, ever composed, faltered. Color touched her cheeks, subtle but real. The first time anyone aboard Duskwind Blade had seen her visibly flustered. That's," she began, then stopped. Straightening, she turned away and walked toward her console, quietly, carefully, needing space to process what had just been said out loud. After a long pause, Keithel cleared his throat, voice dry. "That concludes the briefing." The crew dispersed slowly, exchanging glances that said more than words. Something had shifted, and everyone had seen it. Tyrell stayed at his station, steady and aware. A line had been crossed. One neither of them could undo. But he didn't want to. And in the briefest moment of color across her face, he saw everything he needed to know. She felt it too.